everyone. Welcome back to Thanks for Sharing. I am your host, Jackie Pack, and we are in the middle of a series. This would be part 3 of this series. The next episode will wrap up the series, making it a 4-part series. In our last episode, we talked about the gap, the space between the trigger and the reaction, the hallway your pattern already knows, and the moment you're standing at the entrance to that hallway before your feet start moving. We talked about interruption, what it is, what it isn't, and 3 ways to build a pause in the body, the mind, and in your relationships. I ended that episode by saying something I want to circle back to today. An interrupt without a second response is just a longer pause before the same old pattern repeats. So that's the piece I want to focus on today in this episode, not the pause. The pause is its own skill, and we covered it last week. This episode is about what you're building inside that pause. Today is about the second response itself, not just as a concept, but how you actually develop a second response that aligns and belongs to you. Because here's what I find happens. People can work really hard on the pause, taking that interrupt and creating a gap. They can get really good at noticing activation. They build the pause. They stop walking down the hallway for a moment. And then it's like they're looking around and they have no idea what to do next. They know they don't want to shut down or explode or take on everyone else's feelings or launch into some explanation for 20 minutes. But not the old thing isn't a response. It's just the absence of it. An absence for most nervous systems doesn't feel like freedom. It feels like standing in an open field with no direction. So that's the moment I want to talk about today. The moment of, okay, I stopped, I've paused, now what? But before I start talking about that, I want to say something that I think causes a lot of confusion about the second response. I hear some version of this question often. People will say, when I imagine my second response, I imagine this version of myself that's very calm, wise, and regulated version of me saying the exact right thing. And in practice, that person doesn't show up. So either I don't have a second response yet, or the one I have isn't good enough. I want to offer a different frame entirely. The second response isn't a version of you. It's a direction. It's not a destination you arrive at fully formed once you've healed enough. It's a practice you're moving toward. A small, specific, honest thing that you can do in the gap that moves you in the direction of who you're trying to be, even if it comes out imperfect, even if it comes out messy, and even if it arrives 5 minutes late. What changes over time isn't that the second response becomes perfect. What changes is it becomes more familiar. It's more available. It belongs to you, but it starts out borrowed. It starts out deliberate. It starts out often feeling like you're reading from a script someone else wrote. And that's not a problem, but it can feel clunky. That's what new looks like before it's been practiced enough to feel real and natural. So if you've been waiting to feel ready, or waiting until it comes naturally, or waiting for the healed version of you to arrive and deliver this second response with grace and confidence, let me kindly suggest that waiting is just a more comfortable version of the hallway. It looks like preparation. It can feel like wisdom. But often what it is the pattern is stalling. You don't find the second response by waiting for it. You build it in real time. So let's walk through how you do that. I would say the second response is made of three things: a value, a behavior, and practice. And I think each one of those holds its own value. They often look like standalone items, but they work together and they build on each other. People often skip the first, they rush the second, and they underestimate the third. So let's start with the first one, value. Because I think this is where most people aren't specific enough. And they end up getting it wrong. Not by being dishonest about what they value, but by being too abstract and overly broad. The value isn't, I want to be a better person. The value isn't, I want to have healthier relationships. Those things may be true, but they can't guide you in the moment. When you are activated, you cannot reach for something that general. Because when you're activated, the old pattern has momentum. So the value you need has to be specific enough to answer a question. The question is this: what matters to you more than the relief that the first response gives you? Because the first response is almost always organized around relief. You might go quiet, and the discomfort of the conflict goes away, at least temporarily. If you're an explainer, you explain everything, and the discomfort of being misunderstood temporarily lightens. You caretake, and the discomfort of someone else's distress seems to go away, at least temporarily. The first response is efficient at one specific thing: making the current moment feel more manageable fast. The second response has to offer something the first response can't. And that something has to matter enough to you, specifically to you, that it's worth the discomfort of not taking the easy exit. So the question isn't, what's the right value? The question is, what are you actually willing to stay uncomfortable for? For some people, it's connection. Staying in the relationship, even when it hurts. Not disappearing, not shutting down, and not making the other person feel alone in the room. If that's what you are willing to stay uncomfortable for, then that's your value. Not connection in the abstract, connection with this person in this kind of moment even when everything in you wants to leave. For some people, it's honesty. Saying the true thing, even when the true thing is risky. And not managing the other person's reaction. Not softening or filtering everything so much that the real point disappears. If that's what you're willing to stay uncomfortable for, then that's your value. For other people, it's self-respect. Not agreeing to things you don't mean. Not saying yes when you mean no. And not apologizing when you don't believe you were wrong. Not shrinking to make someone else comfortable at your own expense. If that's what you're willing to stay comfortable for, that's your value. Here's another question that can help you narrow in to find your specific value. Think about the moments after your old pattern wins. After you've shut down or exploded or over-explained or taken on everyone else's emotions. What's the thing that you feel like you lost? Not just in that moment, but across those moments over time. What's the thing you keep losing every time the pattern wins? That thing, whatever it is usually pointing directly at your value. Because the value is almost always the inverse of what the pattern costs you. If the pattern keeps costing you connection, connection is likely your value. If it keeps costing you your own voice, honesty might be your value. If it keeps costing you your sense of self, self-respect is probably it. You might have more than one, which is fine, but I'd encourage you to start with just one. The one that feels most alive, most urgent, or most true right now. The one where if I asked you, does this matter to you? Your body would answer. Your body would have a response before your words. And then once you have that, write it down. Because the writing part of our brain works differently than the thinking part of our brain. Writing it down works two parts of the brain. Write it down not just as a goal, but as a commitment. Even when it's uncomfortable, I'm committed to staying in the conversation. Even when it's risky, I'm committed to saying the true thing. Even when it's unfamiliar, I'm committed to not making myself smaller to manage someone else's feelings. That sentence, that specific, personal, embodied sentence, is the beginning of your second response. Everything else gets built on top of that. I want to add something here because I think people sometimes land on a value that sounds right, but doesn't actually guide them in the moment, which is fine. We have to test these things. And there's a pretty simple way to test whether you found what will work for you. Ask yourself, would I stay uncomfortable for this, even if no one knew? Not would I do the hard thing because it looks good or because it's what a healthy person would do, but would I actually choose the discomfort of not taking the easy exit, even if the other person doesn't notice, or no one gives me credit for it, or even if it costs me something in the moment with no visible payoff? If the answer is yes, you've probably found a real value that will work in those moments. If the answer is more like maybe, if it worked, you might have found a preference or a goal, but that's not quite the value yet. Values don't require a favorable outcome. In fact, they survive unfavorable outcomes. You stay in the conversation, even if the conversation goes badly. You say the honest thing, even if it doesn't land well. You don't shrink, even if the other person is uncomfortable with that. What you do, the value you stick to, feels like success to you, regardless of whether anybody notices or whether the other person responds differently. That's the test. Another way to know if it's the right value is it usually produces a small physical response when you name it. Not a big one, just a kind of settling. Yeah, that. The wrong value, the one maybe you think you should have, will often produce a slight flatness. Yeah, of course. That doesn't quite land. Instead, the settling feeling can feel like a success in your body. You feel it. Now let's talk about behavior. Because if the value is what orients you, the behavior is what you actually do. And this is where people can get stuck in a different way. They know their value, they know what matters to them. But when it comes to the behavior, they can either go too big or too vague. Too big can sound like, when I'm activated, I'm going to have a thoughtful, calm conversation about my needs and the other person's needs. And then we are going to reach a mutual understanding. That would be a beautiful thing. It's also not a behavior you can easily execute in the middle of being activated. It's probably a fantasy of the healed version of you, not a real thing you can do in the next 10 seconds. Too vague sounds like, I'm going to stay open, or I'm going to be present. I'm going to not react from fear. But these are directions. They're not behaviors. They don't have a shape. You can't do stay open the way you can do ask a question or say one sentence and stop or keep my feet on the floor. The behavior you need has to be small enough to execute when you're activated. That's the only measure that matters. So here's how I think about building the behavior. Start with your value, then ask, what is the smallest possible action that moves me toward that value in the kind of moment my pattern usually fires? Smallest possible action. Not a full expression of the value, not the ideal version, the smallest move in that direction that you can actually make. With your actual voice, in your actual body, in the moment. If your value is connection and your pattern is to go quiet, the smallest behavior might be this. Stay in the room, maybe not speaking yet and not resolving anything, just physically staying. Orienting yourself in the room, putting both feet on the ground. Notice 5 blue things. Notice 3 blue things in the room, or whatever color is in the room. Just physically staying in that room. After you are more competent with that, maybe you say one sentence. I'm still here. I just need a minute. That's it. That's the behavior. You're not acknowledging anything to your partner that your partner doesn't know. They've probably felt you leave the room, even if you don't literally get up and walk out. They know you're not present. So being able to just speak to that and say, I'm still here, just give me a minute, that's the behavior. If your value is honesty and your pattern is to explain everything until the discomfort goes away, the smallest behavior might be ask one question before you say anything about your own side. That might sound like, can you tell me more about what that was like for you? And then you just stop. You don't explain, just ask and listen. That's the behavior. If your value is self-respect and your pattern is to apologize, even when you don't mean it, the smallest behavior might be take a pause before apologizing. Not never apologize. That's an overcorrection. Just not apologizing in the first 30 seconds after conflict happens, before you've had time to know if you actually believe there's something for you to be sorry about. Buy yourself that pause. That's the behavior. For some people, I wouldn't say all people, or even most people, but for some people, the quick apology is actually more about ending the conflict. What they don't realize is they are missing the opportunity for understanding, both understanding of their partner and understanding of themselves. Small behavior matters. People often feel like a small behavior isn't worth much. It's hardly even recognizable, right? Like they're doing less than what the situation calls for. Or they feel foolish that they need to start so small. But I'd push back on that. The first response has been doing a very large thing for a very long time. We're not trying to match its size with the second response. It just has to be real. A small, honest, clean thing outweighs a large, automatic thing. Not in drama or intensity, but in what it actually costs and what it actually builds. There's also another truth about small behaviors. They're a lot harder to fake. You could convince yourself that you're staying open without actually changing anything. But you can't say, can you tell me more about that? And then immediately launch into your own side. You can, but you'll also notice that you asked the question and then you immediately went into defending your side. The behavior has to be specific enough that you know whether you did it or not. And that accountability, knowing specifically whether the new behavior happened, is part of what makes it real. One more thing about identifying the behavior. It helps to write it down in advance, because you're not going to write it down in the moment. So during a calm time, sit down, not after a hard conversation, not right before you think one is coming, but when things are going well. Write down your value, and then write down the smallest behavior you can think of that moves toward or is aligned with that value. One sentence, one action, one question. Something concrete that if I asked you, did you do it? You'd know the answer. The success of the behavior is, did I do it? Not, did it make a dramatic difference? Not, did it shift the entire conflict? Just, did I do it? And did I notice when I did it? What makes a behavior specific enough often gets underestimated. People often write down behaviors that feel specific in the moment, but then in the moment they realize it was too ambiguous when the pattern fires. I'll take a breath. That's a good start, but it's still a little abstract because a breath can mean different things. If we say, I'll breathe in for 4 counts and out for 6, I'm going to do that 4 times and keep my feet on the floor while I do it. That's specific enough that your body knows exactly what to do. And you know whether you did that. I'll be more honest. It might be a value, but how does that translate to a behavior? I'll say the first true thing instead of the comfortable thing. That's closer. What about when I feel the pull to agree with something I actually don't agree with? I'll say, I'm not sure I see it that way before I say anything else. That is specific enough to be real. I'll try not to over-explain. Doesn't actually tell you what to do instead. I'll ask one question before I make a single point of my own in any conversation when I'm feeling misunderstood. Gives you some specific measurable behavior. And then the last thing I want to say about behavior is don't choose it based on what sounds most impressive or most transformed or most like the healed version of you. Choose it based on what you can actually do. Slightly activated with your nervous system in your real life. The behavior that you can actually do most of the time in low stake moments and occasionally in high stakes one is worth 1,000 times more than the behavior you imagine doing when everything else finally clicks into place. That sentence, that action, that's your second response. Not the whole thing, just the beginning of it. So next, let's move into practice. Because I think this is where people make the most common mistake of all. So let's just address it directly. Often the mistake here is waiting until the hard moment to practice. I understand why people do this. It can feel weird or unnecessary to practice something when nothing is happening. It could feel performative or silly, or like you're rehearsing for a situation that isn't even real yet. But here's the problem. The moment your pattern activates is exactly the wrong moment to try a new behavior for the first time. When your nervous system is the most activated, your thinking brain is the least available. And the old pattern has all the momentum on its side. Trying to learn a new behavior in that moment is like trying to learn a new dance move at the exact moment when the music starts and everyone's watching. Even if you know the steps in your head, your body doesn't know them yet. The body learns through repetition in low stake moments. If you ask high school basketball players, college basketball players, professional basketball players, they have done countless free throws outside of a game. Right now, the World Cup is going. I'm watching it. I'm watching all the reels of visitors to the United States enjoying the World Cup, the cities welcoming the fans. It's all very heartwarming and is a reminder that, oh, yeah, there is good in the world. People can be good. And it's actually a really bright moment for me and a lot of people to see. I had a daughter who played competitive soccer. I actually had 3 daughters that played competitive soccer. One not for very long. The other played through high school. And then one went on and played in college. The one that played in college, she took it very serious. She was constantly practicing. She would go out and juggle the ball and see how many she could get. And she would do that daily. When she was trying to learn how to do a bicycle kick, which is when you flip back and kick the ball the direction you want it to go, which is not an easy skill to learn. She spent countless afternoons in the backyard practicing. One day I was home and I hear this commotion. I wasn't even sure where in the house it was. I walk out towards where the noise is coming from, and she's coming down the stairs with the mattress from her bed. And I'm like, wait, stop. What are you doing? Why are you bringing your mattress down the stairs? And she said, well, I'm going out to practice bicycle kicks and it hurts because I keep landing wrong. She said, and so I was telling my coach this, and he said, why don't you bring out your bed and then you can land on that? I said, no. We are not going to do that. And I texted her coach and I said, what are you doing telling her this? He responded and was like, I was joking. And I took a picture of the mattress halfway down the stairs and I said, you might need to be specific when you're joking because she's taking you very seriously. Or if you've had a child in theater or you yourself have been in theater, you are practicing lines constantly. If you're practicing for a piano recital, again, practicing outside the moment is vital. The body learns through repetition in low stake moments. That's how the first response got built, through thousands of small repetitions across a long time, starting when the stakes were often much lower than they are now. The second response has to be built the same way. So what does practice actually look like? For some behaviors, it's verbal. If your second response includes a specific phrase, I'm still here, I just need a minute, or can you tell me more about that? Or I want to think about this before I respond. Start saying that out loud. Not in a hard moment, in an easy one. In the car, in the shower, in a work meeting, in a low stakes conversation where nothing is on the line. Just say the words out loud. Give me a minute to think about that before I respond. With your actual voice until it starts to feel less foreign. People often underestimate how much of the awkwardness of a new behavior is simply that the mouth and throat haven't said those particular words in that particular configuration before. The words will feel strange because they are physically unfamiliar, not because they're wrong. Saying them outside the moment will help wear off that strangeness before you need them in higher stake moments. For some behaviors, it's physical. If your second response includes staying in the room, or keeping your feet on the floor, or putting your hand on your chest, Practice noticing what those things feel like in your body when everything is fine. Not because you necessarily need the practice when everything is fine, but because you're mapping the sensation so that when you're activated and you try to do it, your body already has a reference point. This is what feet on the floor feels like. This is what staying feels like. Oh, I felt this before. When I was in college, my first year in college, I moved away. I went to a junior college about 4 hours away from where I lived. I had two roommates who were my good friends from high school. I talked about them on my episode talking about friendship. So me and Jill and Julie lived together our first year of college. That version of me was a pretty awkward version. I've said before, I did not know how to do physical touch. I was very awkward with physical touch. In fact, I just avoided physical touch. So I'm at college. I meet this boy in one of my class. The professor had paired us up for an assignment that would last the entire semester. So we worked on things together. It was just him and I. We'd get together at the library and work on things. We had to work on things outside of class. I enjoyed spending time with him. I thought he was very cute, very handsome. I thought he was very cute. I thought he was very handsome. My roommates knew that. One day after being at the library together, I was leaving to go back to the trailer where we lived in student housing. He lived in St. George, so he was just going back to his apartment where he lived. As we were walking, I was heading in the direction where I lived, and his truck was parked along the way. So we walked, we were talking, and then he asked, "Hey, would you ever be interested in going out on a date with me?" And I said, "Yeah, I'd be interested in that." And he said, "Do you think you'd be interested tomorrow night?" I said, "I think I can do that." And he said, "Okay, sounds good. I'll give you a call and we can get things set up." And I said, "Okay, sounds good." And then he got to his car, he left, I left. My roommates were home. I came in the door. I was very excited to tell them about going out. So the next night, he and I went out on a date. It was a lot of fun. Conversation was super easy. At the end of the date, he's dropping me back off at the trailer where I lived. And he said, "Can I give you a hug?" And I said, "Yeah, I'd like a hug," which was true. I did want a hug. In fact, I was more than okay. I liked the fact that he asked if he could give me a hug, and I wanted him to give me a hug. The problem was, I had never been hugged before. There had not been touch for me growing up outside of touch being violent and abusive. So he gives me a hug. I walk into the trailer. He gets in his car and leaves. My two roommates had been watching out the window. I come in and they're like, "How was the date?" And I was like, "It was a lot of fun." And I told them about it. They said, "Do you want to go out with him again?" And I said, "Yeah, I would love for him to ask me out again." And my one roommate said, "Well, can I ask, what were you doing when he was hugging you?" And I said, "I was counting." And they said, "Counting? Why were you counting?" And I said, I don't know. I just started counting. I knew I had gotten to like 25 or 30 before the hug was over. And they just looked at me like they were seeing a version of me they didn't even know existed. And they said, "If I were him, I would not know that you wanted to be hugged." And I said, "Well, I told them I did." And they said, "That is not what you looked like." My one roommate said, I think we need to start practicing with you because if you want to go out on another date with him, you need to get better at hugging. It was awkward for me. It was uncomfortable for me. I often counted, which I have since learned is something people do when they're in a highly stressful situation. They just start counting. I don't know that I had ever done that before, but I did that when he was hugging me. The good news is we did go out on another date. I was not cured of my awkwardness around hugging, but I was getting better at it. I was practicing. For some behaviors, it's noticing. If your second response is something relational, asking a question, naming what's happening, saying, I need a minute, or saying, are you okay? Or even sometimes if I'm in a session, I'll say, wait, what is that feeling in the room? You can rehearse this inner version of it even when the outer version isn't needed. Notice a moment in a conversation, even an easy one, where you could have asked a question instead of asserting something. Notice a moment where you could have paused before speaking. You don't have to actually do it every time. Just notice the moments. The noticing will build familiarity with the option. It can also help to attach the practice to something you're already doing. If your second response involves slowing your breath, practice it while you're cooking breakfast. 30 seconds every morning, it's already part of the routine. If it involves a physical anchor, like feet on the floor, notice that sensation every time you sit down and just take a minute when you put your feet on the floor. If it involves a specific phrase, say it once during dinner conversation when the stakes are zero. You're not building a solemn practice, you're just building repetitions. The more mundane and forgettable those repetitions are, the better. Because that's how a behavior becomes automatic, not through intensity, through frequency. I also want to say something about timing. People will often ask me, how long does this take? And the honest answer is there isn't a one size fits all answer. I think it depends on how long the first response has been running. I think it depends on how much activation tends to accompany it and how often you have the opportunities to practice. But here's what I can say with some confidence. It takes longer than most people expect, and it's more forgiving than most people fear. The reason it takes longer than expected is because the first response was built over years. The second response also has to be built from scratch. A few weeks of intention and occasional practice won't undo years of conditioning. It'll make a start, but the full shift where the second response becomes genuinely more available than the first usually takes, I'm going to say years, not months. And that timeline can change depending on how much practice is happening outside the hard moments. But it's not going to be quick. The reason I think it's more forgiving than feared is because the direction matters more than the pace. Every time you practice the behavior in a low stakes moment, something is being built, even if you can't really feel it yet. Every time you notice the activation and you don't immediately act on it, Even if you end up doing the same thing anyway, the gap has been registered. The nervous system is getting evidence. Often it's uneven and it's slow, that there's another option. Another thing people ask me is, how will I know if it's working? And I think that's a fair question because the progress isn't always obvious. You're not just going to wake up one morning and find that the pattern is gone. You're not going to have one breakthrough conversation where suddenly everything is different and stays different. I think a lot of people want to describe that's how change happens. That's not what I've ever seen. I think what you're more likely to notice is smaller things. At first, maybe it's too small to count. You notice the activation slightly earlier than you used to. Not much, but you just shaved off a few seconds. But it's early enough that you have a beat of space you didn't have before. The hallway is the same, but you're catching yourself at the entrance a little more often. You notice the old behavior happening, and the noticing arrives sooner. Not before, but closer to during instead of after. Or you notice the new behavior becoming available in easier conversations. The question you can now actually ask. The phrase that comes out less stiff than it used to. It might not feel like your full second response yet. It just feels like something you're still trying, but it's available. And that's new. And then not every time, but sometimes you're in a harder moment and the gap opens and something different happens. Not because you forced it, just because the second response in that situation was close enough to reach. That's the progression. It's not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. I find for a lot of clients, they see it in retrospect, just like they did their first response. But it is real, and it is measurable if you know what to look for. One more thing I think it's important to talk about when it comes to the development of the second response, because I think it can derail people if they're not prepared for it. Initially, the second response is not going to feel like you. It will feel borrowed. It might feel scripted, like you're playing a character that's slightly more evolved than you actually are. And maybe it seems like at any moment someone's going to notice that it isn't real. That somebody's going to notice that it isn't real. Let's address that directly. Because I think people will interpret that as evidence that the second response feels inauthentic, that it doesn't feel natural. It must not be true to who they are. But here's the thing. Authenticity isn't the same as familiarity. The first response may feel authentic, like this is who I am, mostly because it's been repeated so many times that it's become automatic, or that it started so young that when you look back, it's been there most of your life. But at some point, maybe a long time ago, it was also new. A younger version of you tried it. It worked well enough to reduce discomfort. And so it got repeated and repeated and repeated until one day it just felt like who you are, what you do. Not because it was the truest expression of who you are, but just because it was the most practiced. It had been the one that was most needed. The second response, though, starts from a different place. It starts from a value that you've chosen deliberately. not a strategy you developed unconsciously at 5 years old. In that way, it might actually be more authentically you than the first response ever was. It's just not familiar yet. It doesn't have all of the repetitions behind it. So the feeling that it's fake or borrowed or not you, that's not a signal to stop. It's just a signal that this is new. And those two things can be really easy to confuse. So I just think it's worth knowing the difference. Another thing that is important to know as you're developing the second response is there's some resistance to building a second response, even if intellectually it makes sense and you want to. Sometimes what gets in the way isn't skill and it isn't practice, and it isn't even knowing what the value and behavior are. Sometimes what gets in the way is grief. Because the first response isn't only a problem, it was also at some point a solution. Going quiet kept you safe when quiet was the right move. Explaining everything made sure you weren't misunderstood when being misunderstood could have real consequences. Caretaking made sure things held together when they may have otherwise fallen apart. The pattern did something for you. The first response did something for you. Maybe it feels like it still does something for you. And building the second response means, in some real way, letting go of the thing that worked, even if you can tell it stopped working a long time ago. And even if it's costing you more than it's giving you now. That's a loss. And losses deserve to be acknowledged, even small ones. I found that before I had kids, there was so much I wanted to do different than what my experience was growing up in the family I grew up in. Fortunately, I'd gone to grad school. I had learned a lot of things about doing things differently. And I had read a lot of books. Although I grew up with a mom who had a lot of books on her nightstand, even about parenting. So I knew that knowledge itself wasn't enough. I think by the time I had kids, though, I had also learned how to do a significant relationship differently. I also didn't have a healthy model for what a marriage could look like. I had a model that definitely outlined what a marriage should not look like. I've talked about this before, but when my youngest was graduating high school, my husband and I were talking about the youngest now being an adult, getting them all through school. We joked, I feel like I've gone through elementary, junior high, and high school 5 times, not just the one time I actually went through it, but with each of our kids. We were reflecting and talking about parenting up to that point. Not that we thought our parenting job was done. I think we both have an understanding that parenting isn't done because your kids are adults, are technically adults. There's this shift for sure. And so we were talking and reflecting on it. And one of the things I said to him, and I was speaking to the grief of my experience, I said, it wasn't that hard. It wasn't that hard to not be abusive to your kids. If you find yourself feeling resistance to building the second response, not logistical reason, like I don't know how, but more of a heavy reluctance, a sense that something important would be lost or I'm breaking a rule, you might find it's worth sitting with that. Not to talk yourself out of the change, but to honor the part of you that developed the first response for good reasons, that used it as well as you could for as long as you needed it before something better becomes possible. That acknowledgement isn't just sentimentality. It's the kind of honesty that actually makes change sustainable instead of just effortful. Let me share an example of what this development process can look like over time, because I think the arc of it matters as much as the individual pieces. A client that I worked with had a pattern of explaining. When things got tense in a relationship, they explained at length, in detail, covering every angle, making sure nothing was misunderstood. They were articulate and thoughtful. The explanations were often genuinely accurate from their perspective. But also, they often went on too long, and by the end of the explanation, their partner had usually either out or escalated. So we started with the value. After some time sitting with the question, what do you keep losing when this pattern wins? They identified it as connection. Not understanding, connection. They said, I think I explain because I need to be understood. But what actually happens is my partner feels talked at, and I lose the thing I was trying to get. I don't feel understood, and I don't feel a connection. That was the value. Genuine connection, even over the feeling of being understood. So then we looked at the behavior. What was the smallest thing they could actually do? They came up with ask one question before saying anything about their own side. Just one question. Can you tell me more about what it was like for you? And then stop. Not forever. Just stop there, pause there, and listen before doing anything else. They practiced it in low stakes conversations for a few weeks. Just in regular conversations, asking a question and genuinely waiting for the answer before redirecting to themselves. At first, that felt almost impossible. Not because asking the question was hard, but because the pull to explain, to add their own perspective, to fill the silence, to make sure their side was heard, was so immediate and so strong that the waiting felt like holding their breath. But the practice helped. Slowly, the questions started to feel more natural. They even started recognizing when they asked that in low stakes conversations, they were actually interested by the information they got back. So it was slower and it was natural. But this middle part of the process is also the part where a lot of people give up. After a few weeks, the person was having small successes. They'd ask the question in low stakes conversation. Occasionally, they'd manage it when things got tense, but they were also noticing something uncomfortable. The more aware they became of the explaining pattern, the more they noticed how often it was happening. Before, it had just been automatic. They just did it, and then it was over. They had no awareness of the frequency. Now they were inside it, watching it happen, often feeling powerless to stop, even while seeing it clearly. Initially, that felt to them like going backward. like their awareness was making things worse. And I think that this experience is almost universal in the middle stage of building a second response. When you start practicing a new behavior, the old one becomes more visible, not less. It's probably not happening more. It's just that you're paying attention now. The pattern isn't louder. You are. I had a client once who was keeping track, literally marking the times he noticed it happening. And he came into a session and he asked me, do I have to tell you how many times it has happened on a daily basis? Because I know that answer, but do I have to tell you the number of times? And I thought about it for a minute. And I said, I don't know that knowing how many times is the most important information for me to have, although I reserve the right to change my mind. But I think it's important that you know how many times it's happening. The visibility will often come before the change. The awareness, the noticing happens before the change starts, because you can't intervene in something you can't see. And for a while, sometimes for an embarrassing while, you see it clearly after the fact, then during, then sometimes before. And that sequence is important even when it doesn't feel like progress. For this person, the middle period lasted longer than they expected. There were weeks when they thought, I am watching myself do the explaining and I still can't stop, which just says something about their first response and how ingrained it was and how successful it was. But the watching of it, the noticing it, was also building something. And eventually, the new behavior they were practicing became available in harder conversations. Not perfectly. There were still moments when explaining took over. There were still times when they came back and said, hey, can I circle back with you and clarify and ask some more questions I realized I didn't ask? There were times that they came into session and said, I did it again. But there were also moments where they asked the question and the other person said something unexpected, something that changed what they actually wanted to say. And the conversation went somewhere different than it had before. That somewhere different is what the second response makes possible. It's not a perfect conversation, may not be a healed version of the individual or the relationship, but it's a different possibility than the one the pattern always leads to. And over time, different possibilities compound. They build into a different kind of relationship with the person and a different relationship with yourself. Before we wrap up for today, I want to offer something for this week, but I want to make it more specific than I usually do. I'm not a therapist who's big on giving homework, because I think what we're doing actually is a practice, not necessarily just a thinking process. But I do think specificity is what this particular work needs. So here's what I'm asking you to do. Take 20 minutes sometime in the next few days, not right after a hard conversation and not right before a conversation you're dreading. Just a calm, regulated 20 minutes and sit with 3 questions. First, what do I keep losing when my pattern wins? Not what do I regret in general, but what gets lost in the relationship that matters to me when the first response takes over. Let the answer be concrete, whether that's a feeling, a kind of connection, a version of yourself you wanted to show up as, and write that down. Second, what is the smallest behavior that moves toward reclaiming that thing that I'm losing? In the specific kind of moment my pattern usually fires. Not what is an ideal behavior, the smallest, real, practical one. One sentence, one action, one question. Small enough that you can actually do it the next time, even if you're partly activated. And then third, where can I practice that behavior before I need it? Where are the low stake opportunities that exist in my life that I can start practicing this? Even if it's just saying it to myself out loud in the car on the way to work. That's it. That's it. 3 questions. 1 value, 1 behavior, and at least 1 practice run. If you can do those 3 things this week, you've started building something that wasn't there before. You've made the possibility of a second response more real. It won't feel finished. It won't feel natural yet. It'll probably feel a little awkward and a little deliberate, like you're trying something that might not even work, which is exactly what it's supposed to feel like. Let me bring this back to something I said at the beginning of this episode. The second response isn't a version of you. It's a direction. You're not building a new identity or a healed self or a finished person. You're building a path. 1 small behavior, practiced enough times, in enough different moments, that it starts to have some history. It starts to be something you've actually done before, not just something you want to do eventually. The first response has all that history on its side, years of it. That's what makes it so available, so fast, so automatic. The second response for now is new, borrowed, awkward, still finding its footing. But borrowed doesn't mean false. Awkward doesn't mean fake. And finding its footing doesn't mean it won't get there. In part 4, we're going to talk about what happens in your relationships as you start doing this. Because the people around you have learned the choreography of your old pattern. You might have even gotten into a relationship with somebody who could do the similar dance as the other person in your pattern. And when you change the steps, the dance changes too. But we'll get into that next episode. For now, 1 value, 1 behavior, 1 practice run. Thank you for joining me. And I forgot to say up front, please hit like and subscribe if you are still with me. At the end of this episode, I want to remind you that your story matters. There's something valuable in every chapter. Don't wait to share your story until it's finished. Until next time, Jackie.